Today we're going to talk about Chapter 6. This kind of continues the evolution of database design. One of the interesting things about designing databases is that as you're breaking data down into smaller, more manageable pieces, there are some items that kind of tend to follow the data as it travels. In order to support the idea where as you break data down, some of the features that are inherent into this data tend to be absorbed as you break the data down. A good example to work with is the idea of employees. So you have a generic characteristic called or category called employees. Within employees, you would have subcategories that you're going to deal with. Now, the employee would have a last name, a first name, would have a hire date. So you have a generic characteristic that's inherited to all employees. This is a common employee format. So you have the employee scenario with all its characteristics, and then when you break it down from the generic all employee to the subcategories, we'll take the condition of the pilot. The pilot will have a last name, the pilot will have a first name, the pilot will have a hire date, but the category of pilot is unique. And as we continue with this evolution of employee and subcategories, we can also say that you would have another subcategory called mechanic. And continuing with this evolution in this process of generic, everybody has it, then the pilot and the mechanic, I'll introduce another subcategory called the accounting team. All employees have common identifiers. So all employees will have certain identifiers that are unique to the pilot, the mechanic, and the accounting. Now this is where it gets interesting. There are some distinctions that have to be made because yes, they do inherit commonality. So there is an idea that you will inherit some or you will inherit all. In this scenario, we can understand that a pilot is a subcategory and a mechanic is a subcategory. Now you can also continue where the pilot can do some mechanic work and a mechanic can do some pilot work. It is easy to see where these two categories could have some shared commonality. Now when you introduce the accounting section, that's a little bit more difficult to see where they would have shared environments because, well, it could exist that an account could be a pilot, but that would be a rarity. But if for the purpose of this example, you can see where these may share some features and the accounting team is unique and distinct. Now at this level, you can see where we have some items that, they are unique, but they do share some items. And then you have the idea over here where you have still last name, first name, some common features, but the activity is distinct. In order to be able to plot this out on a database, as you're drawing the tables and you're doing the Chan and the UML type process, you can also introduce another identifier to say that as you're doing this database, there are some features that are inherited, and there are also some features that are inherited but are distinct and unique. And that's what we're going to consider. So what we're going to do in this process, we're going to introduce two new identifiers. The circle with one line and the circle with two lines. The circle with two lines gives you the idea that these identifiers are distinct. And a more clear way to do this would be the idea of students. If you are a student, you can either be a graduate or an undergraduate, but there's no scenario where you can be both. So even though you could be a student, when you break it down to the distinct category as to undergraduate or graduate, the identifiers would be the same, but the category has a restriction that you cannot share across items like you can do here. In this scenario, a pilot could conceivably be a mechanic could be a pilot. But in the student, there's no way that you could be a graduate and an undergraduate in any sense of the way. And the idea of this chapter is to introduce the idea of the 0 with 1 line and the 0 with 2 lines, or the O with 2 lines, to explain to you that as you're developing the ER diagram and developing the relationships, you also have to introduce the idea that as these categories are broken down, in some scenario, there are very unique situations where they are distinct and cannot share commonality, or there are some where they have the ability to share common features.